snow on the road. Let's get this snowy on the boaty. Alright, that's perfect. Talk Like a Pirate Day is soon upon us, a mock holiday popular on the internet, where you're supposed to talk in the stereotypical pirate accent, seeping in a lot of ahoys, yeebie meebie, yeebie meebie, yeebie meebie, matey, and naturally, arr. The entire thing is supposed to be a joke, but the accent which the event is dedicated to has become ubiquitous with pirates, at least the stereotypical cartoon kind. Those who prefer a more realistic portrayal of pirates shun the accent as silly, and it is absent in the grittier sorts of pirate media, you know, the whole, "Oh, we're pirates, we're very serious, we are very dark, we don't have powers, we are very serious, we say motherfucker a lot, we say fuck a lot, we swear a lot, but we don't do slaves. We fight against oppressive empires. That is what matters. And we wear cool clothes, we have dark clothes, and we got a lot of leather on. And we say motherfucker a lot." This is part of a general trend where pirate stereotypes, purely because they're stereotypes, tend to get dismissed as ahistorical and unserious, purely because they become cliches. Cartoon pirates have peg legs, parrots, and bury treasure, which means that real-life pirates never did any of that. But as previously shown on the channel, most of these cliches are true, to an extent. Some pirates did have peg legs, some buried treasure, and they did often have pet parrots. And indeed, a great many of them spoke in a distinct manner unique to pirates. But as per usual, the truth is a bit more complicated than the stereotype, and many times weirder. There was indeed a pirate accent, and in some ways it is recognizable to us, in other ways it is entirely alien and unexpected. A lot of context will be needed to properly understand the real pirate accent, how it came about, what implications it had, and the profound and surprising effect it has had on history. But first, we have to start out with the stereotypical pirate accent, the one we hear in the movies and imitate on September 19. It is generally agreed upon that it was popularized by English actor Robert Newton when he starred as Long John Silver in the 1950 version of Treasure Island.
All right then. If I'm captain, then this is orders. All hands ashore, except Israel and Agadir. The two of you remain on board and guard the ship.
Aye, sir.
If you're in trouble, you can signal me by fire in the cannon.
Aye, sir.
And when you're...
In 1952, he starred in Blackbeard the Pirate, and 2 years later in Long John Silver, both times as the titular character. Born in Dorset, England, he decided to use an exaggerated West Country accent for his iconic pirate speech. So the pirate accent is stereotyped wasn't a synthetic invention, but an actual dialect unique to this region of England. However, spontaneous outbursts of "Yar" never seem to have been a facet of the West Country accent. It could be used to indicate agreement, as in a synonym for yes, meaning that it is possibly a derivative of I. It could also be used to replace are, as in where are we going, what are you doing. Yar could also indicate that something is well done or fine, such as the ship is yar-handed. As for mateys and miharties, mate has been used to indicate a friend since the 14th century, and matey was first documented as being used in 1794, in a naval context as well. But things often came about long before they were written down, so it isn't impossible that some Golden Age pirates would have used it. Moving on to miharties, it was first used in literature in the late 18th century, with the phrase miharts being a few decades older. However, neither of these phrases were unique to pirates or the West Country accent. Some are a bit too quick in giving Robert Newton full credit for the association between pirates and the West Country accent. He was most likely chosen for the role because of a pre-existing association, and the link between piracy and this region goes much farther back. Treasure Island, likely the most influential book in pirate pop culture, portrays characters who speak with features of the accent. Reasonably so, since the book takes place in the West Country, and around the port of Bristol. Indeed, a significant number of pirates would have spoken with this accent or one reminiscent of it, Welsh most significantly. The West Country accent is heavily influenced by a local language called Cornish, which is Celtic, same as Welsh. So it is not surprising that many people find that Cornishmen, Welshmen, and the Irish speak in a manner reminiscent of pirates. A lot of pirates, and sailors in general, came from this region. Census data from 1582 shows that 34% of British-born sailors came from the southwest of England, with 5% from Wales. Almost half of the sailors of this era would have spoken in the stereotypical pirate accent. By 1792, the number had shrunk significantly. Sailors from London were now dominant at 34%, with West Country sailors only taking up 13%, the third largest group, and Welshmen having shrunk to 4%. However, the overall number of sailors had increased. It was just that Southwestern and Welsh took up a smaller portion of the overall number, which had grown in other places. I couldn't find any census data for the 17th century, but throughout the golden age of pirates, we can assume that the number would have hovered somewhere between the 1582 and 1792 data. This makes a lot of sense, since we have documented a lot of notable pirates and sailors from this region. Henry Morgan and Bartholomew Roberts, both argued to be the best pirates of the period, were Welsh, as was Howell Davis. According to one story, Blackbeard came from Bristol, as did Woodes Rogers, a noted privateer who became governor of the Bahamas and ended Caribbean piracy. He was an associate of Somerset-born William Dampier, the Buccaneers scholar and explorer who single-handedly left behind the most writing of any pirate, and he in turn was friends with the infamous Henry Every, born in Plymouth, Devon. All in all, some of the most infamous and influential figures from the pirate age spoke with the stereotypical pirate accent. But did they really? Certainly there would have been a West Country note to their speech, but it would have been significantly different from the yapping of the average West Country land crab. Sailors' speech was different from their earthbound counterparts, and it doesn't seem as if the West Country dialect was widespread enough to be commonly adapted by all sailors and pirates. It is difficult to know for certain how people back then spoke, since we have no recordings of it. Fortunately, spelling was not standardized, so everyone wrote the way they pronounced things. So accents are more easily detected in period writing. Linguists who have studied the writings of sailors in letters, journals, and logbooks find that it is so distinct from other contemporary works as to be its own dialect, ship English. This will be discussed in depth later on, but an example is necessary here to show that the West Country accent was seemingly not that influential in overall ship English. Here's a sentence in normal English. It would have basically been the same in period English. She was chained with many of her slaves. Now, in the Celtic dialects of English, Welsh, and Cornish, there's a tendency to move around some of the words in a sentence. They would have phrased the sentence like this: with many of her slaves she was chained. However, the original sentence, written by a mariner in 1691, went as follows: she was with many of her slaves chained. As we can see, this word order is different from both normal English and the Celtic accents, meaning that sailors, and pirates by proxy, would have generally spoken in a different manner. Of course, those from the West Country would have spoken ship English with a West Country tang and certain features of it, but not enough so to make it the pirate accent. Because pirates came from all over the British Isles, as the census shows, each one bringing their own natural accent. But it doesn't stop there. Pirates also came from other European countries, from France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Sweden, all of whom had their own regional dialects, and all of whom had their own sailor's language. That is not to mention the Native Americans, Africans, and Asians, which sailors interacted and traded with on a frequent basis. Virtually all sailors knew at least a few words from other languages, and many of them spoke multiple of them. All of this influenced the way in which they spoke, and it influenced the languages they came in contact with. That is not even mentioning the professional jargon necessary to work the fine machinery of a ship, to learn navigation, weather, fighting, all of the lingo a sailor needs specifically for this profession. All of these strange factors, and more, merged together to create the strange phenomenon that was ship English, the true, forgotten pirate dialect. Alright everyone, on this episode of What Are We Drinking? Let's have a look what we got inside the kunka here. So here we got some of the
old coffin varnish that I still got left from the previous episode on Caribbean empires. When we're finished with that one, I still got a cup of tea over here that you probably can't see. And when we finish with this bad boy, old coffin varnish, maybe just to varnish this little thing here, then we're gonna be doing with some Irish whiskey. That's excellent, isn't it? Yeah. I'll be corking up that bad boy in just a minute. Alright, let's just finish up this one. Alright, it's like they say, give me the punch ladle, I'll fathom the bowl. I'll fathom the bowl, I'll fathom the bowl. Give me the punch ladle, I'll fathom the bowl. Burns on the way down. Truly sweeps the deck, so to speak.
But before we can discuss ship English in depth, some sort of baseline is necessary. Because period English was different from modern English. That is not to say that it was unintelligible. A student can today read and enjoy the works of Daniel Defoe, John Milton and William Shakespeare, even if it might be a bit weird and sometimes difficult. However, I imagine that a lot of students read these works in a very posh, received pronunciation, even though early modern English sounded vastly different from the English heard in a, Sherlock Holmes drama. The most noticeable facet of early modern English is that it sounds less like British or American and more like modern Irish. The reason why Irish English retains these sounds is because Ireland was being colonized by the English during the 16th and 17th centuries, when the English would have been spoken like that. This also means that the Irish accent retains some features from EME. Very noticeable is the rhoticity, that is, the R at the end of words is still pronounced, like father, water, governor, whereas in modern received pronunciation, or King's English, it would be father, water, governor. Though non-rhoticity did appear in the 17th century, it didn't become an acceptable part of British English until the end of the 18th century. Even then, rhoticity would remain a part of rural English accents until the mid to late 20th century, especially in the West Country. Notably, non-rhoticity was never adopted in the Americas, which is why American speech is still rhotic. In isolated pockets of the states, such as in Appalachia, speech forms and habits of Elizabethan English would even be retained into the mid-19th century. Spelling in the early modern age was also entirely different. As aforementioned, it was phonetic. It also retained a few traces of Old English, also known as Anglish or Anglo-Saxon. A prime example lies in the iconic ye olden. The ye is not actually pronounced as ye, but as the. This is because the y was used to replace the old runic letter thorn, used to represent the unvoiced dental fricative th, as in thistle, thief, and the voiced dental fricative th, as in the, this, that. You might, however, be familiar with ye as an alternative to you. This was a more medieval or Renaissance thing, and had become rare by 1600. The same applied really for all sorts of Shakespeareish language. By the late 17th century, thou and thee, as a form of you, was restricted to the Bible, religious use, Quakers, and some regional dialects. Early modern English also had a few different sounds from modern English. Dental fricatives were less common in certain words, like theatre, which was pronounced theatre. This is why the name Thomas is not pronounced Thomas, even to this day. Overall, if you'd end up in the 17th century, you'd probably be surprised over how easily you would be able to understand and communicate with the average English person. Well, it wouldn't be any more difficult than the average English person today, I suppose, especially once you go out into the provinces. Would you want some soul, you bottle of water? There is a video here on YouTube that recreated speech from the late 17th century, based on the transcription of a trial. Here's a snippet from it.
He says he went out to town on Saturday after St. Ignatius's Day, which was Saturday the 3rd of August, but there being a discourse between him and his brother why he should make choice of a Saturday, which he thought, it seems, was an inconvenient day to take a journey on. And upon that, his brother made answer again that night he would only go to Standon, my Lord Aston's house, where he should meet with company to go along with him into Staffordshire. What day of the week was St. Ignatius's Day? St. Ignatius's Day was on a Wednesday.
As you can see, well, here, people didn't really sound like the dramatized Shakespearean actors, like sort of you often imagine, and more modern than expected. There is naturally a lot more that could be said on early modern English, but owing to the scope of the video, which is, kind of limited, we have to move on.
In 2019, Sally J. Delgado published a book titled Ship English, Sailors' Speech in the Early Colonial Caribbean. Based on a study of written documents from the period 1620 to 1750, Delgado concluded that English colonial sailors, pirates included, spoke in a unique dialect of English. The corpus, that is the body of research material, consisted of documents composed by working mariners and people related to them. These included depositions, handwritten records, letters, logbooks, and records related to grievances, vessel movements, but also letters between sailors and their wives, the latter of whom adopted their husband's way of speak. As aforementioned, it is difficult for us to know for certain what period people spoke like, but fortunately, since spelling wasn't formalized, everyone wrote phonetically. They wrote things by how they thought it sounded. So if someone had a unique dialect, you can often detect it in the writing. One issue is that many, if not most, sailors were illiterate, and many of these documents were written by clerks. However, beggars can't be choosers, and for a modern researcher, they remain the closest we have to accounts of sailors' spoken language.
There are two big questions here, too. The first is, how? How would sailors just develop their own unique way of speaking? Secondly, what did it actually sound like? The former one is a bit easier to answer, so let's start up there.
Typically, we associate dialects as geographically bound. A bunch of people live together in a certain region and develop a unique way of speaking. Ship English is interesting in that regard in how it developed not among a stationary group, but one characterized by its high mobility. In truth, it shouldn't be surprising that a group like sailors, who spent most of their lives among themselves, isolated from the rest of society out on the open sea, should develop a unique way of speak. Two caveats need to be mentioned here. For one, even though English sailors spoke in a manner unified enough to be categorized, each group or vessel seemed to have been slightly unique. Dialects within a dialect. The second caveat is that what distinguished Ship English the most was lexical. Most of what made it unique were the words and phrases necessary for operating a sail ship. Some might believe that this was the only unique component of Ship English, and thus that it wasn't a unique dialect, even though a pattern points to them speaking with a unique grammatical structure, different pronunciation, inclusion and omission of regular words, and unique words unrelated to sailing per se. Neither was Ship English spoken exclusively by sailors, but also land-based groups that primarily interacted with sailors. This included land and maritime communities in England, and especially the colonies, but also various indigenous and even enslaved communities. There is a reason to believe that Ship English took heavy influence from African languages and dialects, and vice versa. Sailors partook in the intense bartering economies of West Africa and Madagascar, where the dialect likely accommodated African forms of speech. As the 17th century progressed, the African presence in the colonies became larger, and sailors would have interacted heavily both with free and enslaved Africans when acquiring goods and services. Just as Ship English would have adapted to African speech, the growing Caribbean accents would have developed from Ship English. Sailors were the glue that held the isles together, and some of the English African slaves would have been most familiar with and learned from. Much of the influence is lexical. In the Dictionary of Bahamian English, one example is the entry sound, meaning to examine a person. It derives from the nautical method of investigating the depth of water with a line and lead. Indeed, a distinguishing feature of Ship English was how easily it incorporated words and features from other languages that sailors interacted with. Here it must be mentioned how diverse and multinational sailors were, not just as a group, but as individuals. Sailors were mobile and might serve under the flags of many different nations during their lifespans, and it was almost a norm for them to be at least bilingual. Knowledge of languages was especially valued among pirates and smugglers, so much so that sailors who knew more than one language were often mistrusted and intrinsically thought of as criminals. Knowing multiple languages opened up brand new venues of espionage, interrogation, intelligence gathering, and illegal sale of goods. Colonial powers were very keen on restricting trade with other powers so as to maximize their own profits. Nonetheless, they were unable to prevent the free flow of sailors seeking work or barter, and the spread of ideas between the maritime cultures of Europe. Even though some pirate crews strive to be monocultural in order to avoid ethnic tension, the realities of their grim life often obliged them to just recruit anyone they could get. In addition, pirates were often so desperate for men as to force unwilling sailors aboard. This usually resulted in pirate crews being more diverse and complicated than regular crews, especially national navies. Pirate crews included Englishmen from all over the Isles, Scots, Irish, colonial Englishmen, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Scandinavians, Greeks, Germans, Spaniards, and Africans born both in the Old and New Worlds. As another caveat, it must be mentioned here that Ship English was just one European maritime dialect, with each maritime culture having its own ship dialect. There was Ship French, Ship Dutch, Ship Spanish, and so on. Spanish seems to have been the language most influential in Ship English. This should come as no surprise, since Spain dominated the Caribbean colonies, and Spanish speakers would have constituted a majority of trade partners, prisoners, forced pilots, slaves, enslavers, and jailers for English colonial sailors. The influence of Spanish can often be found in the lexical. Sailors did not speak of silver, but of plate, derived from the Spanish plata. The Spaniards themselves were often referred to as Españols, soldiers as soldados. A very interesting case is the word rumb, a line or direction on a nautical chart, first appearing at the end of the 16th century. It seemingly derives from the Spanish rumbo, meaning a course or direction. This word likely spread to English sailors, either from Spanish or French co-workers. Another interesting case is the use of the word deseado. In one journal we can read the following: making the best of our way to windward to weather deseado, but gaining no ground. Deseado is a slight anglification of the Spanish deseado, meaning desired. So in normal period English it would be to weather desired, or in modern English, to desired weather. In Spanish it would be clima deseado, with the adjective after the object. This example shows that sailors were not only familiar with Spanish speech, grammar and words, but adopted it to their own speech and writing. Spanish also has a tendency to preface the sound combination SP with an E, such as España, and this feature can likewise be observed in Ship English, such as in the aforementioned Españols, instead of Spaniards, but also prominently in the word spy, meaning to spot or see a ship. A lot of sailors' documents write it as espy or espied, such as he espied a vessel they're riding, they espied a vessel, they espied a boat, espied a sail and chased him. I have already started to touch on what Ship English sounded like with the Spanish influence, and to preface this section I must stress that even though I have studied linguistics on a basic level at university, I will make no attempts to fully recreate Ship English. Even though I might try to pronounce certain things, I doubt it is fully accurate. Well, maybe there would have been some Nordic sailors who would have spent enough time with Englishmen and Españols to babble in my atrocious accent, but it is not unlikely. In 1935, William Matthews did a study on sailors' pronunciation between 1680 and 1700, and it remains a good baseline for modern studies into sailors' speech. Matthews primarily analyzed naval logbooks from the period, and found that there were certain conventions used exclusively in the sea trade. Firstly, Matthews found a tendency for sailors to raise certain vowels. For example, the short vowel e is raised to the long vowel e, especially before nasal consonants. So a sailor would say 20 instead of 20, friends instead of friends, and penguins instead of penguins. On the opposite end, e was also subject to lowering and variation with e, in words such as witch becoming wetch, sick becoming sec, and wind becoming wend. In words with a double O, such as took, stood, and look, sailors seem to have pronounced them more like you, so took, stood, and look. O was often realized as a. For example, hospital became aspital, lost became last, and shot became shat. The A sound was often lengthened in certain words into a, such as saw becoming saw, straw becoming straw, and hoss becoming hars. With hospital becoming aspital, we can also observe the H dropping from the word, which also appeared in Ship English. Words like Hobson would become Obson, and in medial positions it was even more common. Hogsheads became hogsheads, likelihood became likelihood. Other letters such as W could also be dropped, wood becoming ud, and westwards turning into westerds. W and V were often interchangeable among sailors, very turning into wary, vinegar becoming vinegar, wade becoming vade, and away, away. Another interesting feature is the interchanging of alveolar and bilabial nasals, that is M and N. Astern into starm, handsome into hamsome, impressed into impressed, and November becoming November. The final feature I found to be very distinct is the dropping of G from words such as bearing, becoming bearin, and lashings becoming lashins. Grammatically speaking, Ship English featured heavy nominalization. For example, instead of saying, the first man they tormented, they would say, the first man they gave torment to. Instead of, they spied a sail and chased him, they spied a sail and gave him chase. Sailors also had a tendency to use simple forms of to be. Were was quite uncommon. It only appeared in statements marked for subjunctive mood, such as, except he were dead, if he were a Hollander, if all were off my mind. Otherwise, was used more frequently. For example, instead of, we were forced to stand to westward, the document reads, we was forced. And so it goes. Agreeable to you that we was that got out. They met with 2 ships, which was pirates. About 2 of them was gone. There was also a preference for is over are. Instead of, here are 2 merchant men, a document reads, here is 2 merchant men. Pitch, which is wanting. The ships is all gone. In accordance with the stereotype, there is also a tendency to use be in finite contexts, such as they be well set people. The corkers become to cork. This also appears in some sea songs from the period. Victuals and weapons they be nothing scant. Her flags be new trimmed. The dangers great on seas be rife. Alright, I think it's about time we pour up some of the old Irish whiskey here. We're going to be talking some about Sweet Ireland later on in the video. It's very related to the old pirate accent, truth be told. Aye, there we got a nice shot. In the old Cuncas. From the old Cuncas from Galicia. From my fellow Celts. Aye, that's sweet in it. Alright, as they say, give me the punch ladle I found in the bowl. I'm not gonna sing again. Oh. That was pretty good actually. Kind of a caramel taste. Ooh. It is impossible to talk about sailor and especially pirate speech without a discussion on swearing, which formed a fundamental part of their everyday speech. As written by the satirist Ned Ward in regards to sailors. No man can have a greater contempt for death, for every day he constantly shits upon his own grave. Much like regular English, we do need a bit of a baseline on swears and vulgarities before we can delve into how sailors turned up the notch. When people think period English, they usually think snooty Victorians, but early modern people, as we have seen, spoke very differently, and they were much less prude. Even the upper classes were relatively fine with using vulgarities such as the F word and the 4-letter C word for vagina. In the King James Bible of 1611, we find words like dung, piss, and whore. The breast of the plough had not become the bosom, and at the court of Queen Anne, it was common for the maids of honor to utter arse. The taboo against physical words largely comes from Christianity, especially since they were sparse in Hebrew. Therefore, the prudeness we associate with history did not really come about until religious revivals in the mid-18th century, Methodism especially, which was after the golden age of piracy. This means, of course, that some more religious people and groups like Quakers and Puritans would have been more disinclined towards swearing and vulgarities. So, swears and vulgarities related to the physical body, disease, filth, and the bathroom were quite common. Especially common were insults and swears related to sodomy. Now, sodomy as a concept is heavily misunderstood. It basically referred to any sexual act not intended for procreation, but by the 17th century mostly referred to sex between men. However, they did not have any concept of hetero or homosexuality like we do today. This is a very complicated topic which is hard to give a conclusive answer to, purely due to the lack of documentation, and the documentation we do have being very weird without context, which is often lacking. If you wish to learn more, I do have an entire video on sodomy in the period and in the maritime community. Calling someone a sodomite, or specifically a bugger, was incredibly common. Bugger is today seen as a sort of silly insult, but back then it was the equivalent of calling someone a 6-letter F word. It could also be used quite flexibly. Bugger off, damn those buggers, I'd be buggered, bugger me with a marlin spike, English bougre, etc. Part of the reason why it was so severe to call someone a bugger was because of the religious connotations. Sodomy was considered a crime, both religious and secular, and technically punishable by death. I say technically because those condemned were seldom executed. Most people didn't really care, and it was accepted that everyone sinned in some regard. You would only really be executed if you did it against someone's consent or against animals, because they believed that interspecies intercourse would produce horrific half-breeds. I have some instances of people believing this in my video on sodomy, and it is highly disturbing. Indeed, swears, curses, and oaths were often of a religious character, and these were considered the most severe. Most of them were left out of written records, and in general, pirates and sailors could probably swear much worse than we can imagine. One historian speculated that the reason we have next to no sea shanties preserved from the early modern age is because most of them had to be censored. Anyway, religious swear words included what you can imagine. Stuff related to devil and hell, damning God and Jesus, that's basically it. Simple phrases like damn you, god damn, and by God were very common and considered offensive. Though it remains as such in many cultures today, others consider it silly. I think the film Treasure Island does a great job at illustrating the weight which can be put behind a simple swear like, by God, which would have been considered very grievous in the period, as you'd be taking the Lord's name in vain.
2 guineas. Is that it? By God! 2 guineas.
In 1691, Boston shoemaker William Smith was sentenced to the stocks after publicly swearing at his wife. This is what he allegedly said. God damn you, the devil rot you, pox take you. This is a short list of examples of how people could have cursed in the period. Then we have what could be called polite swear words and insults, or those considered acceptable enough to be included often enough in written records. This included things like bastard, dog, bitch, son of a bitch, drunkard, thief, pirate, blackguard, scoundrel. These words in and of themselves are not offensive, but become offensive when applied in the right context, to imply that a targeted individual has characteristics reminiscent of the word in question. It was a way to insult someone's honor. Bastard was grievous because you were the product of non-marital sex. The taboo against dogs could either be seen as someone being subservient, but it could also come from a Hebrew taboo in the Bible. Drunkard, thief, pirate, etc. again insulted someone's honor. Swearing, oaths, and curses was of course a huge part of the general maritime community. In the biography of a Madagascar pirate, John Plantain, the following is written, which gives an insight into the London view on colonial sailors and pirates. John Plantain was born in Chocolate Hole, on the island of Jamaica, of English parents who took care to bestow him on the best education they themselves were possessed of, which was to curse, swear, and blaspheme, from the time of his first learning to speak. This is generally the chief education bestowed on the children of the common people in those parts. Now that's a roast if I ever read one. Swearing formed a crucial component of a sailor's vocabulary, and pirates especially. Taken captive by the pirates of Jeremiah Coughlin, William Snellgrave wrote the following. The execrable oaths and blasphemies I heard among the ship's company shocked me to such a degree that in hell itself I thought there could not be worse. For though many seafaring men are given to swearing and taking God's name in vain, yet I could not have imagined human nature could ever so far degenerate, as to talk in the manner those abandoned wretches did. Indeed, whilst sailors swore a lot, pirates would take it to the next level. They had no restrictions on it whatsoever, and would often compete in who would come up with the most creative swear words, and the worst phrases. A good pirate commander was expected to swear better than any of them. In spite of the shock invoked by sailors' gruesome speech, it formed a vital social function in their communities. Swearing affirmed the speaker's trustworthiness and strength of character. When a sailor cussed, it was to show his earnesty. It isn't a coincidence that swearing can mean both to say a foul word, but also to make an oath. Swearing does apply to a broad spectrum of speech acts, both from making formal pledges in the form of religious oaths, such as swearing on a Bible, to blaspheming and, finally, just saying vulgar profanities. In a rough environment like that aboard of a ship, when you had no one to trust but your shipmates, your word wasn't just enough. You needed to swear to make your word worth something. Swearing was used to mark agency, for a commander to assert authority, or for his crewmen to defy his orders. It was a powerful tool, so it should come as no surprise that some privateers, like Woodes Rogers, placed heavy restrictions on swearing, in order to keep his men under control. Penalties ranged from simple fines to physical punishment. For pirates, swearing became a way to assert their independence. Swearing wasn't merely used internally to boost the character and trustworthiness of sailors, but also externally as a weapon. By swearing, threats to someone's life became more earnest. An excellent interrogation tactic if you wanted to find their loot. Swearing and insulting even became part of pre-battle shouting matches in attempts to intimidate enemies into surrender. Sometimes it worked, especially if you had sufficient arms to back it up. All in all, swearing formed an important ritualistic part of sailors' speech. It was used to mark the sailor as earnest and of good character, and used by him to assert his authority and independence. Clever prisoners could adapt to the pirates' language in order to save their skins, as was documented by William Smith in 1744, regarding the capture of Governor Plunkett by Bartholomew Roberts, some 20 years prior. They quickly followed him, took him, and brought him back again to Bunce, where Roberts was, who upon the first sight of Plunkett swore at him like any devil, for his Irish impudence in daring to resist him. Old Plunkett, finding he had got into bad company, fell a swearing and cursing as fast or faster than Roberts, which made the rest of the pirates laugh heartily, desiring Roberts to sit down and hold his peace, for he had no share in the palaver with Plunkett at all. So that by mere dint of cursing and damning, old Plunkett, as I'm told, saved his life. As can be seen from the examples shown in this video, piracy as a crime could be reflected in speech. Language and communication was as much part of their defiance as their physical offenses. Knowing multiple languages was seen as potentially piratical. Swearing was used to defy the traditional order. Ship commanders often got nervous when their sailors started swearing too much. Woodes Rogers was very wary of seditious speech aboard his vessel, not only forbidding swearing, but beating his second mate for quote-unquote abusive language, and whipping a sailor for wishing that he was aboard a pirate. In one of my recent episodes, I discussed the mutiny aboard Charles II, leading to the rise of Henry Every. Battle lines were being drawn between the Protestants and Catholics of the company, with one man allegedly saying, "God damn the king, fuck him to the pit of hell." In short, language was a political and a piratical act, and both pirates and their opponents were aware of it. This is best observed in the biography of a pirate named George Cusack. He is nowadays little known, but he is one of the most important figures from the history of pirates. Why? Because he was the first pirate of the Golden Age to have a biography written about him. The published story of Cusack preceded that of Henry Morgan, Bartholomew Sharp, Henry Every, and all of the shenanigans from a general history. The biography of George Cusack set the tone for how pirates would be treated in period pop culture. This biography is interesting in that it not only records Cusack's actions, but his development as a writer and orator. Cusack is quoted at crucial points in his career, such as taking his first ship, being captured by the governor of Anguilla, and defending himself in court. Included are purported speeches from the pirate, excerpts from his journal, and quotes from his trial. Cusack's language becomes indispensable to his history. Within the biography, Cusack's words are as much piratical as his robberies at sea. What Cusack does is using authoritative language to usurp power from colonial rulers, defying both God and king and challenging the state of civil society. Such is the enormity of his crime. Cusack's first language crime coincided with his first taking of a ship. When capturing the 250-ton Hopewell, the biography says that he collected all of the letters and writings of the captain and threw it overboard, to prevent it from being used in court. This was standard procedure for all pirates, literally erasing history to protect themselves, and to allow them to sell their captured ships. Cossack allegedly took it to the next level, going so far as to throw a Bible overboard. When some of his crewmen complained of this, Cossack said, "You cowards! What do you think to go to heaven and do such actions as these? No, I will make you officers in hell under me. Go thou thy way, divinity. What have we to do with thee?" By forsaking the Bible, Cossack realigns himself with Satan and opposes himself to all earthly authority and civil society. Perhaps it was an exaggeration from the author, but it does illustrate a point that still rang true for pirates. Their greatest crime was not the robberies themselves. 1 or 2 ships taken does not impact the economy especially. The biggest crime was the implication that one could break social conventions and directly oppose the ruling order, something which sailors and pirates could do simply by swearing, or saying that they wished to be aboard a pirate ship. Cossack is unraveled, however, when he is eventually captured by Governor Howell of Anguilla. The biography presents a purported excerpt from Cossack's journal, in which the Grand Pirate's former language of grandeur has switched to one condemning Howell as the thief and criminal, calling him a rebellious and unworthy bandida. It shows that Cossack, once bested, has lost the authority he once tried to usurp. The purpose of this in the biography is to show that although Cossack spoke with big words, he did not have the power to actually back them up. He is a usurper, and is now the gullible victim of his own delusions. In the final segment with the trial, Cossack's arguments are continuously dismantled by the judge. It should be obvious that the biography of George Cossack, like most pirate narratives from the period claiming to be factually historical, is in fact allegorical. What's interesting here is that the purpose of the story is to degrade piracy itself and mutinous sentiment against the state as a whole. Even though it is an exaggeration, there is a point to it. Language and words were incredibly important to pirates. For them, it was a life and death matter if there were documents that could prove their guilt. They were desperate to have commissions legalizing their plundering, even if it were commissions to hunt and fish. Next to no pirates actually called themselves such, but privateers. Other pirates were documented as even throwing books overboard, as was documented by William Snellgrave. We all went into the great cabin, where we found nothing but destruction. Moreover, 2 large chests that had books in them were empty, and I was afterwards informed they had all been thrown overboard. For one of the pirates, upon opening them, swore. There was jaw work enough, as he called it, to serve a nation, and proposed they might be cast into the sea. For he feared there might be some books amongst them that might breed mischief enough, and prevent some of their comrades from going on in their voyage to hell, whither they were all bound. Upon which the books were all flung out of the cabin windows into the river. Here we can see the pirates aggressively censoring written works, fearing that an educated pirate might be convinced not to continue with his life of crime. It isn't a coincidence that so few pirates left behind any written works, especially after the 17th century, when the crackdown truly began. It is also interesting to compare it to the relatively high illiteracy among sailors. The written word was one of the biggest enemies to their operations. Documents and printed newspapers could spread the word of their crimes, leading to a lowered public opinion and crackdown. Before the biography on Cossack, there had barely been any texts discussing the crimes of English privateers. And it wasn't until the publishing of Alexander Exquemelin's Buccaneers of America that public opinion started to shift against pirates, followed by an increasing crackdown. Pirates thrived from misinformation, confusion, lies and legends. Their very existence and their use of language was more of a threat to the ruling order than the ships they captured and lives they took. Owing to their isolation at sea and interaction with diverse communities, sailors in the golden age of piracy developed a unique dialect, nowadays referred to as ship English. It had unique pronunciations, unique vocabulary, and even unique grammatical structures. That is besides the enormous lexical content relating to the handling and operations of a sail ship. And of course, the sailors and especially piratical tendency to swear in order to mark one's honesty, or even to rebel against the established order. It was a blend of all the international groups interacting with sailors, and in turn, ship English left a significant trace in modern English, with all the words and phrases derived from the maritime world, and especially in the dialects of the Caribbean. There doesn't seem to have existed any taboos against ship English. Many are the books and manuals in the period published with a vast vocabulary of the sea, since it was vital for naval officers and administrators in training to learn this dialect to better perform their jobs. Becoming part of a ship and crew wasn't just about learning the ropes. You also had to learn to speak like the sailors, learn what every bit of the ship was called, how they communicated, and how to swear like them. And then you got moved to a different ship, where they might have spoken entirely differently. It is definitely possible, almost a certainty, that larger groups of pirates would have had dialects entirely unique to them. Sadly, there is not enough documentation to prove what it sounded like. Ship English is the closest we have, and even that is an ambiguous and poorly understood topic. All we know for certain is that sailors, pirates, and those close to them would have spoken in the manner most unique. Language has power, and pirates knew it. They depended upon it. Cheers, matey. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.